What's up, my wizards? It's Dev. Oh my God, yes, that Dev from Mtg down there. We like it a magic, and you know what? Today's deck is what's the line? I had a joke right here. Hold on, real quick. It's not in this inquest. Maybe it's okay. It's kind of. Yes, of course. Here it is, right there. Today's deck is fire. Well, first of all, I have to address this. I apologize for doing the YouTuber thing where you don't have a good joke at the beginning of a video, so you dress it up in theatrics. All apologies for that. I also apologize for it being so dark in here. I'm going to try to fix it in post, but just yesterday, one of my lamps started flickering. When I came in here to check on it, the bulb was smoking. So can't use that one anymore. We're going to burn the whole place down. So again, sorry it's so dark in here. Maybe it's because this deck was just too hot for it. And it might just be. The deck is pretty cheap. It's only like $100 to play this deck right now. And it's completely rotation proof, so it's not going to cut and run on you anytime soon. And it's powerful too. There's like 15 Planeswalkers in this deck. Now, most of them are named Chandra, but they ain't printed a bad one yet. Shut up. I know you're probably going to comment that the Planeswalker deck, Chandra's bad. It's actually not that terrible. Didn't make the deck, but it's not that bad. If I'm going to pay 6 mana for a Chandra in Standard right now, it's going to be Mama Chandra. We're playing 2 copies of the Awakened Inferno, and yeah, it's probably the best Chandra in the deck. I really like that this is good against most traditional things. Against control, it's always going to resolve no matter what, and the emblem is big news against them. But if you resolve it against aggro, and again, it always resolves, you got a sweeper effect on the table. Against mid-range decks with bigger creatures, you just take stuff out. Decks that are based around planeswalkers, just blows them away. So this card is pretty much good against just about every kind of deck you're going to come up against. Now, at the same time, though, 6 mana is an awful lot. I don't want it gumming up our hand too much, and we really don't want to play one if we already have one on the table. So I think we only really need to play 2 in the deck. Now, what I will play 4 of is Chandra Fire Artisan. Now, the Artisan has the one ability that the 6 mana Chandra doesn't have. That's a card advantage ability. Very important to a deck like this. Getting to effectively draw an extra card every turn is just insane in a deck full of so many, like, really powerful cards. So once you get your Artisan down, it's basically like you and you alone get a Howling Mine every single turn. And that's a powerful ability by itself, but we've got cards in this deck that allow us to activate this ability more than once a turn. It's just insane how much card advantage this card can get you, all in just 1 or 2 turns, enough to win the game some of the time, and your opponent can't even really safely swing into it without taking a bunch of damage. Plus, one more thing, in this deck, it's pretty easy to get this card to ultimate really fast. And that's in large part due to Chandra Acolyte of Flame. Here's an important tech for this deck, in case you wanted some tech with your deck tech. But anyway, did you know that if you're able to curve Acolyte of Flame into Fire Artisan, then you can get Fire Artisan's ultimate on the next turn. Theoretically, at least. All you gotta do is play Chandra and do whatever you want with her on turn 3. And then on turn 4, play your Fire Artisan, +1 it, and then +1, or really 0, the 3 mana Chandra. Then, on your next turn, you can 0 the 3 mana Chandra and ultimate the 4 mana Chandra, again, if everything was undisturbed. So that's cool, but that's just one thing. It turns out that this Chandra is a lot like 6 mana Chandra in that there's pretty much no board state where one of these abilities isn't going to be good. I've already talked about how good the first ability on this card is, but again, we got like 15 Planeswalkers in the deck, so it's going to be good almost no matter what your board state is. She won't be giving just herself extra loyalty. But the second ability is the one I find myself using the most often, really, just to aggro on the opponent. But we've got cards in this deck that make that second ability better too. So keep that in mind. We'll get to them a little bit later. Now the third ability will straight up win you games sometimes. We've got a pretty limited selection of removal in the deck, so it's nice to be able to stretch that limited suite of removal with this last ability. Like check out this game where just the ability to recast Chandra's Triumph out of the graveyard forces a scoop out of our opponent. Now, we've already hit 10 Chandras, jeez, but there's actually one more in the deck because I couldn't resist a copy of Chandra Novice Pyromancer, and actually happy that we did this, and we might actually try to slip a second copy of this card in the deck. It's really not as bad as I expected it to be, and that's the second time I've had that experience with this particular exact Chandra this season. It was a little better in the Teamer Elementals build than I thought it was going to be too, so I should really have learned my lesson there, but I didn't. Again, this card has impressed me in this deck too. This is another 4-mana Chandra that goes really well on curve with the 3-mana Chandra. You make a couple of 1/1 tokens, and then you give them +2/+0. And you didn't lose any loyalty by doing this, by the way, on either of your Chandras. So that's a pretty cool little point. But you're also swinging for 6 Jack with what started as just a couple of 1/1s. And that is kind of threatening in and of itself. But you can also get extra mana out of this. Pretty important for a deck that's trying to cast a 6-mana Chandra. This will help you do it on the very next turn with just your 4 lands. You don't even have to drop another one. So that's pretty cool. But there have been plenty of games too where this third ability has been pivotal, picking off a planeswalker, killing a creature to get stuff through, or just helping deal the last few damage that really sews the game up. Now with that, we're done with the Chandras, but that doesn't mean we're done with the Planeswalkers, because we also kind of have to play, to my mind, we kind of have to play 4 copies of Sarkhan the Masterless in the deck. Perfectly bridges the gap between our 4-mana Chandras and our 6-mana Chandra. Really need a 5-drop in between there, and I think it's either Sarkhan Hellkite or this, but with so many Chandras in the deck, I think it'd be dumb not to play Sarkhan the Masterless, because this effectively makes like the 3 or 4-mana Chandras, sometimes on curve, into just giant 4/4 flying dragon machines with effectively haste. That's the thing about Sarkhan, is that playing a Sarkhan after a Chandra or 2 on curve is basically like making 2 4/4 haste dragons, and that can get pretty out of control very fast. I'll go so far as to say that Sarkhan is ironically the planeswalker that has won me the most games while messing around with this deck. It just turns out that having even like 1 extra planeswalker out when you drop a Chandra is often lights out, but any more than that, and it's almost a guaranteed game win because your opponent is probably not planned for like 2 and then the next turn 3 4/4 dragons just swinging at him out of nowhere. And really, I don't mean to drag on. See what I did there, Sarkhan? Anyway, don't explain the pun, Dev. I really like this with the 3-mana Chandra. Even though you have to do something on turn 4, preferably 4-mana Chandra, JSYK, just so you know. But it's usually just 3-mana Chandra into a Sarkhan safely will get you quick wins, y'all. Like, check out this game right here where we're able to do just that. And suddenly, our board is full of tokens from Chandra and 4/4 flying dragons, and it's just really hard for an opponent to do anything about that. The last time I talked about Chandra's Regulator, I used a clip from the song Regulators by Warren G and Natog, and the video promptly got demonetized. So I won't be doing that again. Learned my lesson there, but it turns out actually getting to play with this card, before I was just talking about it during spoiler season, but actually getting to play around with this card really hammers home how insane this ability is in a deck with 11 Chandras, because it's not regulated, if you'll pardon the pun, to just like 1 use a turn. If you've got 2 Chandras out, you can activate, you can basically trigger Regulator twice on both of those Chandra activations. And if you have the mana to burn, and usually it's well worth it, then again, some of the lines you can take are just crazy. Draw 2 extra cards a turn with a Fire Artisan is pretty good. Put multiple, extra loyalty counters on all of your Planeswalkers can be great with Acolyte of Flame. Or just cast multiple spells out of your graveyard in the same turn with Acolyte of Flame. That's ridiculous, because doubling up loyalty abilities on Chandras is well worth a mana almost no matter what ability you're activating. But let's not forget that it's got another ability on it. So honestly, I think you could push it to 4 Regulators, mostly because of that ability. You can always just discard any extra copies of Regulator you get once you have a Regulator down, so I think you might be able to squeeze an extra copy into this deck. But yeah, you can just discard any ancillary mountains that you might get in the late game, red cards you can't cast this turn that you're looking for a specific card, piece of removal, Sarkhan, whatever, another Chandra. Just discard that chaff for just a mana. That's good too, So this has actually been an all-star card in the deck, and I really wanted to focus a lot of the talk on this card because it's just been that impressive. Like, here's an example of a game right here where just a regulator and 2 Chandras essentially forces a scoop out of our opponent. But we are very far from done with Chandra branded merchandise in this deck because we're also playing a few kikis. Well, 3 copies of the Embercat here, and only 3 because I didn't feel like we need to stretch this to 4. Just put it that way, we got to use our slots wisely in this deck. And when this isn't specifically casting a Chandra, it's just a 2-mana 2/2. Yeah, it can get a little boost from Novice Pyromancer, and that's nice to have every now and again. And sometimes it's just nice to have a creature to block for our Chandras if we're trying to protect them. And that's mostly the reasons that it's in the deck. Not a whole lot of other reasons outside of that. I mean, again, if it's not specifically ramping into a Chandra, it's not really doing much for us, but that's it. It can ramp us into 6-mana Chandra, or even, curve into a 4-mana Chandra. That can be really important some of the time, so Embercat just barely pulls its weight. Turns out a much better 2-drop is Runaway Steamkin. It turns out this can also ramp us into a Chandra, so it's just like better than Embercat. But along with Embercat and again Novice Pyromancer, these are a bunch of different ways of making extra mana for this deck and casting Chandras ahead of schedule, which is really important in this deck, and it just gives us another way of doing that while also giving us the biggest creature in the deck. All things considered, getting up to 4/4 is actually a pretty buff dude in this deck. We really don't have a lot of guys, and this also benefits from the boost from Novice Pyromancer. So that's important, and it doesn't die if you're trying to sweep the board with 6-mana Chandra, which is something I should point out as well. Now, we are playing a little bit of removal, like I said earlier. Can't spend too much time on this, but we're playing all 4 Shocks, and then 4 Chandras Triumph, which is awesome. I won't say it's strictly better than Lightning Strike. It's not, but this is rotation proof, so we're kind of forced into it for all we know at the moment, and that's fine. This gives us a card that can take down 5 toughness stuff. That is really, really important. We're going to lose Fight with Fire, and a lot of the reason that people brought in Fight with Fire wasn't necessarily in games where they could kick it. That's one reason, but a big reason was that it's a red thing that can take out 5 toughness creatures at a reasonable cost. This takes out 5 toughness creatures at an even lower cost, and that's really, really important. Again, provided that you have a Chandra out. Gotta give love to Shock, right? I mean, I'm trying to kind of juice the number of instants and sorceries that we have in this deck for 3-mana Chandra, and I just feel like it doesn't get any better than 4 copies of Shock. Take out small creatures in the early game, or just double cast it with a 3-mana Chandra when you draw it in the later game to take out relatively big stuff, or even just finish games off sometimes. It's just kind of a utility card, but you can't really, discount how good that utility can be. Shock is important. But there's one more card in this main deck, and it's probably the weirdest one, but I'm playing 2 copies of Glinthorn Buccaneer for a bunch of different, very specific reasons. First of all, it's a 4 toughness creature on turn 3, so it leads into a 4-mana Chandra, or a Sarkhan, or even a 6-mana Chandra fairly well, because it's going to be blocking with those stats on turn 3. It's going to be blocking fairly well for you all the way up until turn 5 or 6, and if all it does is help you protect a Chandra, that's good enough. But it also leads to some relatively fast starts. Again, if you go, 3-mana Chandra into double spelling Glinthorn Buccaneer and another card on the next turn, you can actually start doing some real damage in the early game. So I don't mind the haste on this either when it does need to attack. But again, you need to leave it up on defense. Does a pretty admirable job of protecting your walkers, and we need that out of our 3-drop. Again, aggressive when it needs to be, defensive when it needs to be, and the ability on this really, really works well, I shouldn't have to tell you, with Chandra's Regulator. They go together very nicely because you're going to get extra damage every time you activate a regulator, and there are even going to be some games where this extra stretch ability will help you win. I was actually able to capture that on camera too. Glinthorn Buccaneer pulls its weight a little bit in this game, considering that it just wins the game outright for us on attacks without even having to get through for combat damage. Now, we're playing 25 lands in this deck, but they're obviously not all red sources you see. I actually think we could cut out 4 more mountains and just play like Interplanar Beacon or something for the life gain. It might be worth it, but I want my guaranteed red sources for non-planeswalker purposes, so I ended up on 18 mountains here, but the 3 Blast Psalms have been very important on multiple occasions. This is effectively a main deck sweeper for us against smaller decks, and really, aggro decks end up giving us an awful lot of trouble some of the time, because we really don't get set up with our best stuff until turn 3 anyway, so sometimes Blast Zone can be really important, even if it's just removing one big threat from the tables. Now here's here's our board. Something else that could use some work, because I'm not sure if the 4 Leyline of Combustion have to actually be in there. It's actually pretty decent against Esper and other spell-based decks, but for the most part, Leyline has not been the best card in the board, far from it, so I think you might be able to flex these slots, but the 3 Fry I think is pretty much a sure shot, even though you might want to up this to 4 in the matchups where it's an important card. It's an extremely important card that takes out the best cards in the Esper deck, for instance, and even other decks beyond that, so Fry is insane, but so is Lava Coil. Instead of the 4th Fry, I went with a 1 copy of Lava Coil here, just to add to the number of instants and sorceries so that we can play when we need to, again, adjust the power level of 3-mana Chandra's 3rd ability. So it's nice to just have extra options, and in games where we know we're going to have to deal with a lot of creatures in the early game, just 1 copy of Lava Coil to add to our Chandra's Triumphs and our Shocks and stuff can be an important call, but Flame Sweep is going to be the best card in those games, and I've actually considered putting it into the main deck and just cutting Embercat and Runaway Steamkin and stuff, but I'm not sure. You might not actually have to cut Runaway in that scenario, but in any case, I don't know that I'd want to play any early game creatures if I was going to put this card in the main deck, but it gets sided in so much against aggro decks because, again, it takes some time to get set up, and all these small, like, white weenie decks, red aggro, even black-white vampires and stuff. There's even some merfolk decks out there for the next month while you're playing this deck in the current standard environment. There's a lot of decks that just play a bunch of small creatures in the early game. Mono blue is still a thing, too. It's just, there's a lot of them. So Flame Sweep is a really, really important card to side in a lot of games against these aggro decks to give you some breathing room. Really like this card, maybe the most important one in the sideboard, but it doesn't mean we're done dealing with control. Not only do we have Fry and Leyline, but Tybalt's important in those games too for keeping them off of Absorb and a bunch of other life-gaining cards that they might have access to, like Revitalize and a bunch of other stuff I shouldn't even have to tell you, but this will come in too against decks that just try to play a huge Hydroid Krasis as part of their game plan, and on Arena, you'll run into lots of decks that play a Johnny's Pridemate, Bloodthirsty Aerialist, and a ton of life gain effects. Tybalt is very effective against them too, so just an important sideboard card that, again, really pulls a lot of its weight here and might deserve a 3rd copy. Now here are your power rankings right here. Final score Nintendo 64, which is pretty good for a $100 deck that's going to last you well over a year. Pretty good investment for a lot of power here, but the deck does have a foible or two here and there, and I want to discuss those before I break down the power rankings one by one here. Now, first of all, one thing I really want to hammer home should be obvious, but I have to be upfront about it, is that the deck really needs a Chandra to turn on a lot of the important cards in its deck. You know, for Chandra's Embercat to be really any good, you have to have a Chandra to ramp into in your hand. So there's that. For Chandra's Triumph to be full power, you have to have a Chandra on the table in the first place. That can be kind of a problem. For Chandra Acolyte of Flame's first ability to be any good, you have to have other Chandras on the table, or at least a Sarkhan. So you have to have Chandra to, again, turn on or access a lot of the most, the best potential that the deck has. Now, mid-range decks already have the problem of drawing the wrong half of their deck in certain matchups, and we have that problem just like any other mid-range deck, but added to that, we have the problem of also needing to draw a Chandra to really live up to our full potential, and that can be a problem. That dovetails nicely into my next point, which is keep hands with action. Again, it's something I shouldn't have to tell you, but there's been a bunch of games where I thought I could keep safe hands like these that had enough lands to cast important cards in the deck, along with a couple of important early removal spells. And these are the hands that lost games for me the most, it turns out. You need to have a proactive plan when you start the game. A hand like this, for instance, that has a Chandra or even 2 some of the time in it, and multiple cards that allow you to play off of those Chandras that you plan on casting. So keep that in mind. Always keep action and not just like, oh, I got a good early game plan, I can blow a couple of creatures away, but I don't have like a marquee card to plan my game around. Those, again, are the games I lost most often, so keep that in mind. And I did lose a few. I mean, of course, you're always going to lose a few, but in gathering clips and resources for this video, I played 14 games with this deck on camera. A couple of more than I usually do, but in that we went 9-5, which is a pretty decent record, but again, you got to recognize the limitations of a deck like this. But then again, you have to realize the ceiling of a deck like this. Like, here's a board state right here where we end up winning the game because we have a Sarkin and 2 Chandras. And if that weren't enough, our opponent gets all the emblems in the world when we say go. When you actually get to set up your board state the way you want to and protect it the way you need to, it just leads to snowballing into some crazy things happening. And sometimes it's just way too much for an opponent to deal with. And again, that leads to a relatively high power score for a deck that's this cheap. Again, I can't quite call this deck budget. It is right at 3 figures, so it's a hair away from budget, but it's as close as it gets. And at a price tag at only about $100, just slightly north of $100, a power score of 8 is pretty good. There's just a ton of really, really hot planeswalkers in the deck. Again, that time, no pun intended. In terms of speed, we take a little bit of a nosedive there. We are not a fast deck. We can get fast starts like I showed you earlier, where we just Regulator into 3 mana Chandra, and then we get Sarkin later on down the line, make 4 tokens, get in for 1 million. There are fast starts that win by turn 6, but they are few and far between. A little bit more methodical. We have to exercise some of our removal, keep the board relatively clean, and curate the board state that we need to win the game, and it takes more than a few turns a lot of the time. The deck has a relatively high amount of synergy. I'll give it a 7 here because, again, it falls apart if you don't have a Chandra. But the moment you do have a Chandra, the synergy kicks into overdrive and you can make some really, again, crazy plays. But if you don't have Shay out, things don't look quite as good. So it really depends on its synergy, and there are going to be times where you don't have it. So it's not through the roof or anything. Now, the middle of the rankings includes some middle-of-the-road scores here, but we're slightly above average in terms of versatility again. We got a decent creature removal suite, but it's not going to kill like really, really big stuff, and we're not going to be able to use too many removal spells in the same game, even with 3 mana Chandra. Plus, we kind of have a game plan that involves curving out. You know, we want to go 3 mana Chandra, 4 mana Chandra, Sarkin, into 6 mana Chandra if we can get the lands for it. Sometimes Regulator is part of our curve, so we play a turn behind, and that's not often extremely versatile. Let's put it that way. You know, we're not necessarily interacting or dealing with what our opponent is doing if all we're doing is curving into our important cards, so that doesn't lead to the highest versatility score. As far as resiliency, again, just slightly above average, I think, because there are going to be games where you're losing, Chandra into Sarkin, you win. So it's kind of resilient, and of course, if you're able to get to 6 mana and drop that Chandra, sweep the board and start applying emblems on the next turn, that's fair resiliency too. You get a Fire Artisan down, you start drawing extra cards and getting the things you need to catch back up. There are ways in which the deck can be resilient, but it's not going to be every game by any stretch of the imagination. I also can't really give the deck a high offense score either. We are playing some small creatures, but it's not like Embercat is the most aggressive thing in the world, and it's also not that aggressive to like drop 3 mana Chandra and get to swing in that turn. The deck really wants to put together a board state, and again, that's going to take more than just a few turns a lot of the time, so the offense score isn't very high. We might win in a couple of bites once we do put the proper board state together, but that's not going to happen all at once. We're not extremely focused on offense. That said, we're a little bit higher in defense, but like I said about these removal spells earlier, they're not going to be removing really big stuff off the table, and we don't really have a main deck sweeper that costs less than 6 mana, which can be problematic at times too, so the defense score isn't super high either. Now, as far as the consistency score, 8 isn't necessarily low, but this is a little bit lower than you might think it would be. We're a monocolored deck. We draw a fair amount of cards. We can get rid of chaff with Regulator. We can draw extra cards with Fire Artisan, for instance. So you'd think we'd be a little bit more consistent. We play a bunch of 3 and 4 ofs. We get the cards that we need, but at the same time, like I said earlier, we need Chandra out to turn on a lot of the cards in our deck, and again, make them live up to their full potential. Hey, Ziggy showed up. Finally, you're here, bub. I know the people missed you, but anyway, a bunch of people were just ready to leave comments like, no cat, this video, bad video, dislike, but no, you came to save me. I appreciate that. But anyway, I hope you get a chance to try this deck out. It's only like $100 on TCG Play right now, and again, completely rotation proof at time of writing, so it's going to last you a good long time, and for $100, you could do a lot worse. Let me just put it that way. Again, $100 is not necessarily what I would call budget by any means, but it's a lot less than a lot of competitive decks, and it can hang. So if you wanted to give it a shot-ski there, just hop on over to the first link in the description and go over to TCG Player. They sponsor my content, but they just are where you're going to get this deck for cheapest. I can truthfully say that. So click the link in the description if you're interested in playing this thing. And yeah, do the other YouTube stuff while you're at it. Like, share, subscribe, comment, tell me how you felt about it, how you'd build it differently. And of course, if you have $1 a month, then hit the link in the description, go over to the Patreon, support content like this. And if you do that, I'll let you vote on what decks you want to see next. Not that into a Chandra deck? Well, you could have affected YouTube history and changed the vote, because this is actually a tie. I cast a tiebreaker for this deck. It was either this or rotation-proof Gruul Stompy. So you could have cast a tie-breaking vote instead of me for a, or you could have, Ziggy, if you had kitty dollars. But anyway, you could have cast a tie-breaking vote in that poll if you had just put $1 a month into the Patreon pot. So do that if it sounds like something you want to do. And I guess I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind. Yeah. Mwah.